Boomeo, Boomeo, learn just like only a Boomeo user can. Learn some strats, any kind. Get inside info on how to play. Look out for Boomeo. You don't even know what that is, do you? So, Debears is someone you may now know for doing some analysis for ESL Pro League last year. He's obviously the comedic relief on Put Up or Shut Up. He actually won a recent episode of that. And not a lot of people will know that he had a fairly long career in CS 1.6 and is one of the first generation players and a classic name. Now, here's the problem with Debears' career, is that during his career, he was always a good player. At times, he was one of the better NA pros. The problem is, obviously, this isn't a perfect analogy, but in terms of the difficulties he had in his career, in contrast to how good he was during the equivalent of regular season games and smaller lands, against still the same top-level competition, I would contrast him against T-Mac, Tracy McGrady. Because famously, Tracy McGrady was one of the best players in the NBA in the early 2000s, the first half of the 2000s. And his problem was he was stuck on bad teams and he was injury prone. And so he never got out of the first round of the playoffs as the star player of his teams. He just never got the breaks. It always went wrong. He always lost the seventh game and always lost after winning initial games. And it was always a tough situation for him because he was such a good player. So as a result, we look at him as someone with wasted potential. Now, Debears was like that because aside from basically a couple of results and only one really big one, he never had those big breaks in his career. He'd always be in the team that in online play was good, and he'd always be the guy who at the smaller lands would do well, but at the big majors, he always suffered, and famously, as a result, this superstition developed called the Debears curse, where all the CPLs up until the end of 2005, and he was going to them from the end of 2001, his teams would always come in with potential to do well, sometimes as among the top NA teams, top 2, top 3 teams, and they would fail to do anything of note, and they famously, this is the Debears curse, would never crack top 16 at the CPLs until really late on. And this is something where CPLs at the time that we're talking about, the summer event, the winter event, they were the biggest, the most important majors of Debears' era. And because he was stuck in these second, third, fourth best NA teams, he generally didn't really travel internationally. He mainly, for most of his career, stayed in NA, and those were the big tournaments that meant a lot for him. And so as a result, because he would fail, and then because this curse became attached to him, even though at times he was in some of the best NA teams, because they never delivered on their potential at the CPLs, he had to have a journeyman career where he played for many different teams, many clans and teams throughout his career. And what would always happen was he'd be on the really good team, he'd be acknowledged as a good player, they'd bomb, he'd have to go away, he'd play with friends, he'd play with other ex-teammates, he'd go down a level, he'd go to the bottom to the middle of invite. We're talking like, at this point in time, like the 8th best team in NA, or sometimes lower than that. He'd work his way back up by playing well, getting the right roster move shuffles. He was always a fun teammate. People liked him, and so as a result, he'd get his shots, he'd play lots of lands, he was a very active player, and then he'd earn his shot back to get into a better team again. They'd go to the big land, the same thing would happen again, and because the curse followed him, it's kind of like existence with the majors now in CSGO. It got so that eventually, doesn't matter if people think you're good and acknowledge that you know what you're talking about, in his case, can play up to the level that you can. If they feel as though you're cursed and something goes wrong in the big tournaments, eventually, unfortunately, people don't want to be a teammate with someone like that. And thus, he had a very difficult career. But it shows when you look how many teams he played in, and especially that he did have a big moment later in his career, a very impressive result for an NA team, but very late in his career, very late in the game, when many other people would have quit and he'd had to go through many teams. It looked like his chances had all gone by him. That just shows kind of the tenacity he had, the fact he loved Counter-Strike and he loved to compete. And so he's a guy with a very interesting story. And because he's not one of the most decorated NA players, this is a story where I won't just drift over it. I'll go into a decent amount of detail and kind of really track you through his story. So Debears really came on the scene in NA in 2001 in a team called Elite Underground. And the main players from this team that people would know would be Jaden and Debears, who obviously were a duo for a number of years. And then there was also a player called Funk, who famously with Forsaken later on would be quite infamous in the scene, but had some decent placings at CPLs. And a player called Notshot, who in the early days was around in the, we're talking about the very early, retail days of CS. He was around in the top teams and was known as a good player. So famously, this Elite Underground team went to the first big major in CS, which was CPL Winter 2001, a very stacked tournament. And when you consider how stacked it was, like top 12 were all pro teams. There was some really good pro teams, didn't even make it that far. RDW, PAG, these were teams that were some of the better NA teams. They didn't even crack the top 12 or top 8. No, they didn't crack the top 12, in fact. And this team managed to finish 17th, 24th. And that was pretty good because it was a 128 team tournament. And at this tournament, there was a situation where they were actually doing decently and they looked like they had a chance to go a little bit further. But famously, there was a situation where Funk, who was the 6th man and wasn't going to get to play in this match, they asked him if he knew where Nutshot was, one of the better players in the team. He lied. He said he didn't, whereas actually he knew that the guy was sleeping in his hotel room. He played the game. Famously, Funk went like -1 to 11 or something ridiculous. They lost the game. And that was famously a moment where they kicked that guy. They really hated him. I know Debears really despised him at the time. And it was a really key moment because that was actually the first time where the Debears curse began, but actually that was the one where it wasn't really his fault in many senses. He was one of the better players in the team at the time, and in fact, because of the fact he had skills, he got a little bit of shine off it. People saw him and Jaden were pretty good players. He had kind of naughty aim. He actually, if you ever saw the classic 1.6 movie, it wasn't from 1.6, it was from earlier on, but one of the first big frag movies was Frag or Die, created by BDS and on the Geek Boys So Game site. And he has some frags in there when he's in Elite on Underground. It's when he was on, I think he has the frag where he's on DOS 2. And so after that, in 2002, there was a big shake-up of talent because X3 started the next Cal Invite season. Well, at least after the final. They started the 4th season of Cal Invite. They'd always won all the tournaments, but they'd lost to DOP in the final before. And they lose early on in the season. They're not winning the games. And so eventually, a bunch of the X3 players break up. They were the best NA team at the time. And we saw a bunch of other teams formed. So around this time, Debears was playing with Jaden, his teammate, in a team called Darkside. And they were a bunch of talented players who'd come from being a much lesser team to having a bunch of talent, but they didn't survive out the season. And Debears would leave and form Team 3D. He was one of the founding players of Team 3D. People might not know that. And so in Team 3D, there was the classic trio who was in X3 and who was in 3D later, which was K-Sharp, one of the most talented NA players ever, Rambo, probably the all-round best NA player ever, and Bullseye, who was like the glue guy, who was a really clutch player, who didn't have great skills, but was kind of like had a winner's mentality, had a really good mentality. And so added to them was Jaden and Debears, and also a player called Smeeze, but he was really just the 6th player, and then a player called Bronx, but he was also kind of like the 6th and the 7th player. They were kind of like sub-players. So at the time, this seemed like, wow, you've paired like some young up-and-coming talents with these old veteran talents. Team 3D looked really good, but because they formed during the Cal Invite season, they didn't play that season of Cal Invite. So they played in the secondary league called UGS, and in that league, they did pretty well. They like won it. They looked pretty good, but they didn't get to play in the main Cal league. So no one really knew, like, were they the best? Online, they looked really good. In scrims, they were wrecking people. They were doing really well, and they were doing really well in the online games. And there were a number of demos of Debears, etc. And he looked like a really nutty player, like a really skilled player. He had loads of like AWP shots, and he was a very fast flick shooting player who seemed to use a high sensitivity and move around the map a lot. So they come into the next major, the CPL, and remember, X3, they finished 2nd at CPL Winter 2001, and before that, they'd always been the top NA team, so these guys were used to winning. They were used to walking in there, and CS in 2001 was very much an individual game, and the game hadn't been nerfed to some degree by some of the later patches, such as we were playing on 1.5 by the time you got to CPL Summer 2002, that you could individually carry the game if you had a K-Sharp and Rambo. And they had Big Dog as well, by the way. But coming into 2002, this was the first CPL, the first major, where it became more about team play and tactics because they nerfed some of the individual skill. And at this tournament, the Debears curse continued again because 3D managed inexplicably to finish 17th to 24th. They lost to the Australians of F0 in a shocking upset on Cobble, where the Australians knew this bug where you could throw these smokes over the top of the wall into B and they could, as a result, smoke off the site. No one knew that, and so they had a revolutionary way to kind of upset the team. It was MR12 at the time, only 12 rounds a half, so you also... It was much quicker to upset someone if you lost the pistol, and then they got the 3 rounds because there was no Galil, there was no FAMAS, it was just MP5s as pistols, which is a pretty good weapon to have there. You know, you could lose games by losing pistols and having gimmicks like this. Then in the lower bracket, they played MTW, who was a good team, one of the best German teams at the time, and they lost this game as well on Aztec. And so after going out the tournament, I think, yes, it's true, Debears choked. The team in the whole choked. They did pretty poorly, but he was kicked, Jaden was kicked. They kept the X3 players, the legendary players here, And 3D decided to rebuild using TSO players. They took in Moto and Kane, and they took in Steel from GX, one of the former LND players. They made like a super team of NA pros who were all proven on LAN, and they did go on to win the next CPL and be a very good team. Now, Debears himself, even later, would feel victimized by being kicked. He felt like this wasn't fair because he said that one of the reasons why that they lost that CPL was that the practice was really terrible. And that actually what had happened was they hadn't practiced properly. They just messed around in scrims. They didn't believe in tactics, which is why later they got Moto from TSO. And they just thought because in the old era you could just be the best players and win and play freestyle, that they could just do this and they didn't need to practice properly and run strats and that they would win. And so when they did really badly, they thought, right, well, it's because of the new guys. We didn't used to lose when we didn't have them. So obviously they're the reason why we failed. So they kicked the Bears, they kicked Jaden. Now, what happened now is later on in 2002, so 3D became the undisputed best number one team in NA, and they won the World Cyber Games qualifier for the USA. The World Cyber Games was another major, and it was one where it was all national teams. You had to be all from the USA, all from Canada, all from Sweden, and you had domestic qualifiers. Now, Debears played for a team and went to the WCG qualifier. He played for a team called Eminence, who were kind of like a low invite team. Invite was sort of the top 12 or so teams, top 10 or so teams in the division, the best division in online play in NA. Cal Invite was the best division at the time. And he played for a team called Eminence, which is a bunch of like okay players, some of them whom would go on to be some alright teams, but some would never be seen again. And he was kind of just playing with friends at the time and obviously trying to get over the reputation of having been kicked and people thinking he's just shit on LAN. And in Eminence, they had this weird approach, which I don't know if they copied it off this, but famously one of the best Quake clans of all time from NA, a team called Death Row, used to tag up with different numbers. So each person would be like D something or other. So for example, D16 famously was Machiavelli, the legendary Quake dueler in Quake 2 and Quake 3. So in Eminence, they did something similar, and Debears actually was E13. I don't know why he picked 13, but obviously when you consider how unlucky he was in his career, maybe it was a fitting number. Now, funnily enough, they didn't do well at this WCG qualifier, but there is a slightly amusing note, which is at the time, Debears was dating some girl. I can't remember if her alias actually was Baby Girl or something, but famously at the qualifier, if you won the qualifier, you went to Korea. You went to, I can't remember, I don't think it was Seoul that year. I think it was somewhere else in Korea to represent USA. And obviously his team didn't make it, but famously at the qualifier, she shouted out during a match like, "Baby Girl, want to go Korea?" And so that's just something that, listen, if you know the kind of people Debears fucked around with, that makes a lot of sense. So by the time we got to CPL Winter, the next big major, Debears went with the Eminence team, as far as I remember, but they got banged out, literally lost 2 and went out. It was a double limb single map tournament, and they lost the upper bracket, they lost the lower bracket, not to good teams, just to NA teams. So you'd think at this point in time, is Debears' career going to go anywhere? Well, next year, Jaden, his old mate that he'd played, obviously, and he'd even played with Eminence with, they managed to get back into a top team because someone gives them another chance, because you have Tech, the Elite Clan or the Elude Clan, whatever they used to claim their name was. They didn't have a proper official name. This team had done decently at the CPL. They'd managed to finish top 12, and they had Elude, who was a rising talent, and they had like some okay players. Funnily enough, they'd had Funk, but he got kicked, obviously, bringing in Jaden, and Debears don't want to play with Funk after what happened in Elite Underground. So they bring in Debears and Jaden. It's their chance to get it all back. And very quickly online, they become one of the best NA teams. And Cal Invite, 3D is obviously, they're the reigning champions of the CPL. They're one of the best teams in the world. And in online games, Tech's actually going back and forth with them. There's a few classic demos, one on Fire where they lose to 3D, one on Inferno where they beat 3D, and there was a great Debears demo on that one. This was kind of a revenge match for him because he really wanted to beat 3D a lot and he was very motivated to, whereas they didn't think online play actually mattered back then. But crucially, there was a tournament in NA before the next major, CPL Summer, which was that earlier in the year, around the spring, 3D had gone to their first big European tournament. They'd gone to Click Arena in France, a tournament that was a complete train wreck, and they hadn't had a deep finish there. They got an upset in shocking fashion. So then we had Killerland back in North America, which they chose to attend rather than attend the first ESWC. Because even though ESWC was a major, because it was the first one, and it wasn't as a result of major in our sense, we've retroactively applied that term. Because it was the first major and it was in France, they had cold feet that, oh, this is going to be like Click Arena. It's going to be a train wreck. Nobody got paid from Click Arena, so they were like, fuck that. We'll just go to Killerland, which is in NA. It's only NA teams, and first place was like $5,000 or $10,000 or something. And they're thinking they're going to win the tournament because they're one of the best teams in the world and definitely the best in NA. They'd be schooling everyone in NA on LAN. But at this LAN, the Tech clan with Debears managed to beat Team 3D in the final. And so this was a great revenge moment for both him and Jaden, that they beat them on LAN and they were part of the reason why they were able to do it. And so now they go into CPL Summer, the next major, actually considered one of the top teams. People are thinking, well, if they can beat 3D, they could finish top 5 at the CPL. They're definitely going to make a deep run. And this is probably the most tragic of the Debears curses, because they were a very good team online. But it has to be said, Jaden and Debears did have some sort of choking that did follow them around in a lot of their careers. Like, they never would be quite as good online as they were online, or they'd have uncharacteristic weird plays that would just go wrong. And this was the sickest Debears curse ever, because they lost in the upper bracket round 1 game heavily to Funk's Forsaken. Funk had made a new team called Forsaken, and they lost there. So now Funk got revenge on them. The guy that had been their teammate they'd kicked from Elite Underground and then gotten kicked from Tech. And that was not a good team, by the way. They didn't go on to a super deep finish. They did an all right finish there. I think they got top 8, maybe. That was it. They weren't like a godlike team, though. That was like a surprising run that they managed at the time. Then, in the lower bracket, they lost again to an NA team. TSG, not even a sick not even a sick NA team. I think it was the Forsaken game. I forget which one. But they had one game where I remember an anecdote. And this just shows how unlucky Debears was. There was some element of a curse surrounding him. Because Jaden famously was an AWPer, just like Debears was. And Jaden had asked someone to throw him an AWP, and I think it was Ice Salmon that had bought the AWP. And when they threw it to him, you know, I don't know if you know 1.6, but if you face the ground and you throw facing the ground, it actually makes the gun go out higher up above you. And someone threw it like that on Inferno in the CT spawn, and the gun went and fell just behind the fence that's in the CT spawn. And if it goes there, you actually can't retrieve it. It's not like CSGO where you can look at the gun and press X, or well, X is my use button, but wherever your use button is, and pick the gun up. Actually, if it's stuck behind there, unless you can physically touch it, you can't pick the gun up. So as a result, an AWP on a key round, again in an MR12 game, was lost behind a fence, and they were fucked. And everything went wrong in this game that could go wrong. They lost it, and as a result, they went out literally in essentially last place, despite being one of the favourites and one of the better seeds at the tournament. And so again, at this point in time, after this many big failures, people are literally like, yeah, we don't want any part of Debears, unfortunately. Like, there is a curse. It's just not going to work with him. So as a result, when you come to 2004, he's having to play with teams like, and late 2003, he's having to play with like Tau. He plays briefly within UGS, like a classic Texas area team, but who hadn't been good for like 2 years at this point in time. He played with Bio, again, another low invite team. He briefly was in Death is Eternal, which at that point in time, like, they had a lineup that would have some good results at majors that year, but not with him in the team. He wouldn't be there. What happened was he managed to get into United 5. And in United 5, their in-game leader was Hare, who, by the way, is the brother of Moses. And United 5 had Moses and Hare in before, and crucially, Hare had played on Eminence with Debears the year before. So he manages to get, 2 years ago. So he manages to get onto U5 when they need to make a change. Moses is retired. They've already told Fraud that they're going to kick him, essentially, because they're going to make this move where they want to try out a different lineup. And they go to a tournament called Everlan. And I think it was in Canada. And at this tournament, they managed to finish third, but in what are fairly bullshit circumstances. There was one of those scenarios where when they played NOA with Element and Method and all these sick players like that, they'd had a crazy semi-final match where there was one of those bugs on Nuke, where if the flash went under the box, you used to like lose all your rounds for that half. And whatever the situation was, NOA, because they were the big shots, pressured the admins, got things to go their way, and as a result won the game. And so the best U5 could manage here was come third. But this was a tournament with 3D at it, with a bunch of good teams at it. And so as a result, even coming third and taking NOA, considered one of the best teams in the world, that far, obviously they'd come second at the last major before they'd got Element. Coming that far, people thought, right, see, Debears, it can do it. He has got the skills. This U5 team, maybe they're going to be dangerous. An interesting detail about that LAN, by the way, it was very hot at the LAN. And so Debears and Hare at the time were in pretty good physical shape. So don't ask me why, and you can go and look for pictures if you can find them. But they decided to go topless at the LAN and only wear their boxer briefs while they were playing. That's literally all they wore. And you could just see pictures of them with like no top on. And they don't ask me why, but they were playing like beasts, so fair play. So he went to the CPL with this U5 team as well. Not the greatest lineup at the time. They had a bunch of other players, including a player that had been in Bio with him, I think, which is Tool. They weren't that great a lineup, and they didn't do that well, really. Like, they only won one game. They lost a couple of games. Admittedly, they did all right in the games they lost. Like, one of them that they lost was to Four Kings, who still had Dark, who's an elite tier Norwegian player. They were a very good UK team. And actually, that team only then lost to NOA in the next round. So, you know, like, it was kind of a tough scenario, but again, not a very good placing at the CPL, despite the fact he's going with someone who at the last CPL has managed to finish 7th with Hare and United 5. And that. So you can see again, unfortunately, Debears was continually the common thread in these teams not doing as well at their lands. Not always because he was terrible. Some of them he had his problems and he did choking. Some of them, it just never went well for his teams. The whole team would collapse somehow. So then he has to go, because he's failed the CPL, he has to go again and play elsewhere. So he plays for a little while with the Mug and Mouse team, which was a local Texas team that played in a lot of lands there. And it was a classic lineup that they had of players that you remember from them, like Punkville, etc. He went to the World Cyber Games qualifier in 2004. This was the one where the finals were played in CS condition 0, and so would the qualifier. And actually, they play U5 there. They play Hare's team. Not a very good lean. Actually, Hare wasn't in that team at the time. It wasn't a good lineup of U5, and they lost to them 2-1, so that was it. But then, in 2004, the latter part, a U5 team gets made by Hare, which is a LAN team. What they do is they get players from TSG who'd done very well at the ESWC, the major that was in the summer, and they get some of the U5 players, and they make a LAN team that lives in the same house in Chicago. And they make this LAN team, they play a bunch of local LANs, and then online, it's going great again. In Cal Invite, etc., they're a good top team, and in a tournament called the GGL Invitational, they managed to win the tournament, actually, beating Team 3D in the final. And Team 3D at the time, obviously, again, one of the best NA teams. Then the World Cyber Games qualifier comes, and I think the other one was a pre-qualifier before, and at this one, they managed to, or maybe I got that wrong, maybe it was 2003, played with M&M. Mug and Mouse. Anyway, in 2004 at the World Cyber Games, they managed to get all the way to the final. It was a double elim tournament, and because 3D had been upset by Death is Eternal Die early on in the upper bracket, they just run through the upper bracket and they beat Rival, one of the best NA teams at the time, with Fear and all those beast guys, Haynes. They beat Complexity, the best NA team. Well, later on they would become the best NA team. They were on their rise still. Then they have 3D in the final, and 3D has to win twice from the lower bracket to win the qualifier. 3D's won every NA qualifier to that point in time, and they do lose twice to Team 3D. The last game was close, but otherwise they got smashed. And so, again, close to doing well on LAN. This time, unfortunately, losing to his old team that he always wanted to get revenge on, 3D. So he doesn't get to go to World Cyber Games. He's still stuck competing in NA. So then the CPL winter event comes around, the last major of the year, and U5's coming into this tournament thinking, hey, we got a real chance to make noise here, really do damage. We're a top team. We've got dangerous players on our team, a bunch of good players, and they were a solid lineup with Hare's leadership, and Debears was looking like a star player from his online games in Cal. And what happens is, in the second round of the upper bracket, they have to play the Titans. Actually, the champions of ESWC that year, the Danish team, who famously had Wimp, who was a superstar player at age 15 at the time. But because he was 15 and wasn't 16 or something along those lines, there was an age restriction at CPLs, Wimp couldn't play at the CPL. And in the summer, he hadn't been able to play either. He could play at ESWC, they didn't have an age restriction. So at the summer, they'd come like, I think 7th or 6th. And so at this tournament, they would end up coming 7th, 6th again. But crucially, because they didn't have their superstar player, this was a beatable team. This is a team that you'd have a chance to beat. And the game took place on CPL Mill. And CPL Mill was a map that, because the CPL owned it, was only played in online leagues in NA and at no lands otherwise, because the CPL owned the map. So NA teams always had an advantage on this map, and U5 played the Titans on it. And it was a very close game. They only lost 16-12. We were in the MR15 era. And the crucial thing is, this is another classic Debears curse moment, because in this game, Debears was in like a 1v1 or a 1v2 or something, and his team was like looking in good position to win the round, and his computer literally, for no reason, just turned off. And because of that, his team ended up losing this key 1-on-1 or 1v2 or something, and obviously lost a very close game that otherwise might have been winnable, and the circumstances were there to potentially win it. Then, in the lower bracket, they go and they beat one of the best German teams, Mouse Sports, in overtime. So you're thinking, right, well, they're getting further than normally Debears Curse teams do. But then they play a team called Big Rip. And at the time, Big Rip is coming in with a lineup that had done well at WEG. They'd won WEG Season 2 in the summer, and they had a fairly similar lineup. And they come into the winter tournament. I think it was, in fact, the same lineup. And they lose. United 5 loses to them. And at the time, you think, a bit on problem. Obviously, a dangerous team from Europe. But actually, that team would go on to a pretty good finish. Actually, let me think. Was that actually the... Am I getting it wrong? Was that actually the... No, that wasn't... I've got it wrong. That wasn't the team that went to WEG. That was next year. This was actually the team that had Khan and DSN and Kalipo. And this was actually the first big result for Khan and DSN in terms of a big LAN result. I mean, I know now you think of them in Fnatic, legendary players, won majors, some of the best teams of all time, 2009, 2007. But actually, 2006 was very good, but not the best team at the time. But actually, at the time, they were losers. They were people who'd always failed on LAN. They'd been good domestically and at smaller tournaments and online, but never done it on LAN. So actually, this would be a tournament where they'd go on to do a big run. They went all the way through the lower bracket to 4th place. So actually, U5, I think, was really hard done by. And I think Debears was really hard done by, because that was a great team for NA at the time. It was a team that really all gelled together. I think they had a good mix of players. He was playing very well again. He'd recovered his form and become a top NA player again. And it gets crushed. Really one of the harshest times. So again, after that, he has to go and play elsewhere. He goes briefly into Weekend Warriors when they weren't a great team. They were just an Asian team at the time that people thought cheated online to beat Team 3D. He was in Death is Eternal very briefly. He was in United 5 very briefly when they had essentially some of the players from Death is Eternal. Then he joins a team which seems like a step down from all these teams. He goes and joins a team without a bunch of players you're going to know. A team called Jack's Money Crew. And this was a team funded by a guy called Jax, and they weren't a top team. In fact, the players in the team, Debears was by far the most famous in the team. The others were either low-level invite or upper Premier players, so not great players, or they had a couple of Canadian players, Evan and Royal, who'd been all right in some past teams like Nerve, etc., who would seem decent, but they hadn't done anything big on LAN. So this lineup, none of them have success really at CPLs, realistically. And they had a player called Zid as well, who was pretty much an unknown. He was just a LAN player at the time. So they go, first of all, to WEG Season 3. He gets to go to Korea to play in WEG Season 3. I think he was last-minute addition to this team at the time, and his team just gets shit on in the group. They even lose to a team. They lose to the WNV, who ends up winning the tournament, who was the Chinese team with Jungle. They lose to Asylum, which was a bunch of the players who'd later go on to be NOA MTW from Denmark, Zonic, HPX, MG. They lost to Team 9, who were the Norwegian team. It was Real and all those guys. And they just got crushed in the group, and everyone thought, right, well, this team's shit, isn't it? They're not going to do anything. So they go to the major at the end of the year, CPL Winter 2005, and this major was one of the most stacked, if not the most stacked CPL of all time. It had all the best teams in the world there, and at the time, competition was very tough in all the best teams. So everyone thought this is going to be a bloodbath for who's going to have a top placing here. Like, it's one of those CPLs where you expect the top 8 to be all the best teams, and you expect the top 4 to be the very best teams in the world. And amazingly, at a super stacked tournament with arguably the worst lineup he'd ever gone to a CPL with, I mean, not really, Eminence was worse, but of the big names that he'd been with, a team that should have no chance to make it and hasn't done anything on LAN yet, Jack's Money Crew cracks top 3 at a major, at a CPL, and Debears breaks the Debears curse and has an insane run that is one of the epic underdog runs of all time. And at this tournament, his team manages, the funny thing is they start out slow. They play his old team, Mug and Mouse, and only win up in overtime. But then they play Complexity. One of the best NA teams, one of the best teams in the world, the winners of one of the majors of the year, ESWC. They have Fraud in full effect. They have Storm in his prime. They have some of the best tactics. They have been undefeated in online play. And they managed to beat Complexity in an epic match early on in the upper bracket. They lose in the next round in an overtime game to Lunatic High, where Zid plays out of his mind. In this tournament, Zid is not only the MVP, but he is like a straight hard carry. I believe there were even rumours that he was like one of the people who maybe did Adderall or something, or fucked around with some of that shit. I can't ever know, but that's the era when some of the NA pros did do some of that shit because it was becoming popular in NA colleges at the time. But this was one tournament where bizarrely he just went ham, super ham, like MVP level performances, but actually never really did it on LAN after that. He was just an okay NA player after that. So they just narrowly lose to Lunatic High, one of the best Korean teams, a team that had managed to finish, I think, top 4. Was it top 4? Let me think. No, it might have been top 8 at ESWC, the major. So a very skilled team. So they lose to them. They go to the lower bracket. You're thinking, right, well, that's reasonable. They've had some sick upsets, but, they're going to get banged out in the lower bracket now. No, they beat the second best Brazilian team, G3X. Then they play NIP in the lower bracket, in the lower semi-finals. Now, if you lose this match, you finish in 4th place. If you win this match, you finish top 3. Now, there's no universe in which Jack's Money Crew is winning this, because NIP has Zet, who is already the best player in the world. He is fucking unbelievably good.
arguably the best player in the world along with Spawn. Insanely good in a team that's not that sick but has good players in. Heaton and Potty is still in the team. Now, Heaton and Potty are the most decorated players of all time at this point in time at majors, especially CPL seasonal events. They have finished in the top of like seasonal and European CPLs, something like, top 3 like 9 times at this point in time. They have never finished below top 3 at an American CPL, and so this is the match to decide if you come third place. So tradition says they should win the match. Super clutch Potty, legendary Heaton. They've got Valet in the team, a very skilled AWPer. They've got Robban. Actually, did they have Robban? No, they had Inns at that point in time who'd go on next year to be fantastic. Well, 2 years later to be fantastic with Fnatic, actually, and one of the best teams of all time. And they have Zet, a future superstar, looking like at that point in time he's going to go eventually become one of the best players of all time, but in kind of his real debut rookie year. You're thinking, come on, Jack's Money Crew loses this game. I believe it was on Nuke as well, which is a classic map Heaton and Potty just seemingly never lost on. And actually, this team crushes NiP. They managed to crush them completely, and they finished third because in the lower final, they lose to Lunatic High for a second time. The only team they lost to in the tournament, and they go out in third place. But an epic run. Debears has some good AWPing in this tournament. It really is like the tournament to break his curse. I don't know that he was at his peak at this point in time. I don't think he was personally. I think he was at his best in United 5 in 2004 or going back earlier to Team 3D. But in this era, he gets the breaks finally all go his way. He has the epic run. I don't know that it makes up for all the heartbreak of the years before and all the missed opportunities and missed prize money, but it was certainly a very satisfying moment for him. He even described it in an interview with me as literally one of the best moments of his life. After that, Jack's Money Crew isn't the team that's got proper sponsorship. They're sponsored by one guy. He ends up going over and playing in 2006 with Evil Geniuses. And at the time, Evil Geniuses is famously a Canadian team. And it's a team of friends who are like decent invite players and famously one very good player, a player called Stevenson, aka Bloodshot, who was a very skilled player, but always wanted to play with his friends and thus didn't ever upgrade his team or take offers to go to 3D and teams like that. He always just stayed with his friends. And he was so good, he could carry them to like sometimes like a top 12, sometimes a top finish at the odd LAN. Famously, he'd been one of the best players on a team called Nerve that had gone to the silver medal position at WCG 2002 in very unexpected fashion, but thanks to him being a superstar level player. That was before he was with the Evil Geniuses guys. Now, this team takes in Debears. It's all Canadians in him, and I think Lynn maybe was from from America rather, and they go to ESWC, the major. So Debears gets to travel again, this time to a major. Unfortunately, in the second group stage that they get a pretty tough group, and they get banged out by 3D, by NiP. They even lose to the Norwegian WNV team of Configure, KF3, who infamous person. And then they go after that to the next major, WSVG ISC, formerly CPL Summer, but rebranded to be in the WSVG Tour. And this is another classic Debears CPL curse, actually, because they lose to G3X, not a very good team at the time. They lose to Natu's 4Kings team, who actually was a very good team. I think they finished 4th there and had a pretty good international lineup. But again, that puts them out very early on, second round of the lower bracket, and so a very disappointing tournament overall. After that, Debears, again, because of the failures, is forced to go elsewhere. He goes away and he joins a team of Zex. Now, don't think Zex and go, wait a minute, Jaguar, Sunman, Volcano? Mates, that was literally 4 years before. This is 2006 now. Those players have long since gone. This is Zex without any of those players. But it has some good players on it. It has Asian, who was an Asian, who was a pretty good LAN player at the time, pretty hyped. It had CBZ, a veteran player. It had Ions, who was literally like Fraud's friend and was just a poor man's Fraud in terms of AWPing, but was an alright player, invite level player. And they had Magic with a 4, who'd been a decent enough player and seemed to have some promise. And amazingly, they go to the World Cyber Games qualifier, another set of tournaments that actually Debears usually performed pretty good at, because it was top teams, but it was less pressure in some senses. And they get a classic upset where they beat Complexity. Fraud's Complexity, that classic lineup that had actually won WSVG ISC and had a really big comeback and had top 8 at ESWC. And so this is a massive, shocking upset on Inferno. And Debears had actually a classic round, which is a highlight clip of where he kills them with the AWP. Unfortunately, they lose to U5, which is actually a bunch of his old Mug and Mouse teammates in the semi-finals, so they don't get to go to WCG again. He never gets to do that. Then at the CPL, they go with this team again because it worked out, this kind of semi-mixed team, this kind of skilled mix. And unfortunately, in the second group stage, they get the group of death. They get Fnatic, Forest, tentpole, DSN, Khan, who at the time haven't won anything yet that year, but are one of the best teams of the year, making big finishes at all the majors, and would go on to win this major as their first major. They have Complexity, again, the mega team with Fraud that they'd actually beaten at the US qualifier, and they have Team 3D, who'd had a revival in 2006 and been very good at a bunch of the lands, had managed to actually finish second at WSVG New York, a massive tournament, had managed to have some deep runs elsewhere, ESWC, I think they finished top 4. So they got the group of death and they didn't manage to get out of this. In 2007, CGS begins, and it's Source, and it's over on DirecTV, and it's this big league. And what happens is, in season 1, Debears gets drafted, because he's playing with like the Evil Genius guys again, into a team called Chicago Chimera, which was run by DKT, Destruct, Brian Flanders, former UT great and a CS player for many years. And he drafts this team, but then he brings in 2 Canadians to go with them to make an all-Canadian lineup. He brings in Shagwar, one of the best 1.6 players of all time from NA, and a champion. And he brings in GRT, Garrett, who you might know now. He, in fact, is one of the producers of Put Up or Shut Up, and obviously was a coach of CLG, the main team, last year, and was one of the better NA pros, one of the better Canadian players towards the end of 1.6 in 2006. He'd been in a team called Pandemic, which is one of the better teams. They finished like top 4 at WSVG New York. And the problem is, though, those players are going to be in the team, and so Debears is put as like what you call a taxi player, which is basically a sub. But those players have trouble at the border and couldn't come to the regular season in NA, and so Debears and Sunman get brought up to play in the main lineup. He'd also been with Sunman in United 5 in the past 3 years before. He gets to play in the main lineup, and they do pretty well. As a franchise, they place top in NA, and they go to the World Championship. Unfortunately, at the World Championship, they're able to get the Canadian players back in, and so Debears doesn't get to play in that team, and they win the World Championship, but Debears isn't part of the lineup that does that, even though I think they might have shared some of the money with them. Now, because of the fact that he's not supposed to actually be an official player in the team, he's a sub player, he was on an Evil Geniuses lineup where he plays with a bunch of his old teammates, CBZ, Royal, and Black Panther. And it was thought maybe he'll compete in 1.6 while they're competing in CS Source, but obviously he got a shot in CGS. Now, because of the problems with the visas and the fact that Shagwar and those guys didn't actually play such a great role in the Source team in the World Championship, because remember, it was judged by franchise. It was all points from all the games added up, and actually the CS Source team didn't do that great. For the second season, they get back Debears into the lineup, and again, it's all former Evil Geniuses Canada players, and don't do that well actually this season, and it doesn't go that great for their franchise, and they don't make any significant result. So at the end of CGS, which dies after season 2, Debears makes a return to 1.6, and he comes back initially with a lineup that's under Jack's Money Crew, an organisation he's been a part of before, and on paper it looks like a fire lineup. It's Debears, Method, one of the best 1.6 players of all time from NA, player on NOA and 3D, but at this point in time, when he comes back to 1.6, had been terrible in Source. He'd never adapted to Source. He had Sunman, former player of Call and United 5 and Zex. You had Volcano, former 3D, TSG, all these teams. And you had Zid, and obviously who'd been the beast who'd helped Debears break this CPL curse. So you're thinking this lineup's going to be good. And they're actually all right at first, but in the first ever season of online play in ESEA, the first ever season, they managed to finish second, losing to X3O, who on paper were the best NA team at the time. It was Irakanji's team with a bunch of decent players, Savior, 9spot, etc. And they lose in the final to them. Unfortunately, that lineup of the Jack's Mini Crew would go on to actually become one of the most underwhelming lineups in NA. I'm not history because they didn't do much, but just very underwhelming. Because in ESEA, they next went to the Call organization, because Call's team went over to Evil Geniuses, where they'd be Fraud and Sunman and all that. And famously, in online play, people like Method, people like Volcano, sick players, had dog shit stats, like some of the worst ADR in all of ESEA. And so Debears was actually one of the better players at the time, and he's in that team for a few months, but then after that, basically his 1.6 career is over, and he drifts away, and that's kind of it for him. But CSGO comes along. 2013, 2014, he's around the scene. He's gone to ESEA lands sometimes. He's playing with some teams like he goes to an ETS in Canada. He plays with some lower level teams or some ex 1.6 pros that he wants to team up with. Eventually, he gets a gig coaching CLG Red, which he did last year, and doing some ESL Pro League NA, because they're based in NA in like California. I think it's Burbank or something, and he travels there and does commentary and does analysis. And he is someone who knows a lot about the game and is a veteran player. And obviously, since then, you might know him from Put Up or Shut Up, which is a classic game show where he is a very funny guy and he's got a great personality, and he doesn't mind people laughing at him in that sense. So he provides a really crucial element of entertainment to the show. Now, as a player, obviously you can see in his career, he was a very torture player. He never kind of got the results aside from once that his skills might have kind of suggested. First and foremost, Debears was a very good AWPer. He was a very aggressive, flick, high sense AWP type player, but he was a hybrid player. He was also very good with the rifles, and crucially he was good on land with the AWP, but that was one of the things that always seemed to betray him at a lot of those CPLs where his teams never made top 16. Now with a rifle, he had very sick first bullet aim, so he would do those like 3 to 4 bullet bursts and just headshot people instantly with the AK. He was a very sick player in that sense. So his skill and his aim were nuts, but he didn't have the same consistency. He didn't have a very calm mind, a very disciplined mind. I mean, he's someone who always described himself as kind of like an ADD, kind of hyper, you know, all over the place kind of guy who didn't really sit well in that particular sense. He always wanted to move around the map and do something, you know. So I think that's one of his problems when it got to kind of the pressure moments on LAN. He's someone who's a very aggro player in style of play, liked to peek, liked to take aggressive angles. He was a very good teammate. He was a guy who had a great sense of humor, a very funny guy, a very genuine guy, just a nice guy, really. That's why a lot of people did give him chances again to play in their teams, and a lot of people liked to play with him over the years, and ex-teammates would go with him and let him join future teams again and give him future chances. Unfortunately, he did have nerve issues and was something of a choker at the big CPLs. At other tournaments, he could be fine, but at those tournaments, it always went wrong. Now, I will say, as I said before, he was very unlucky. There was kind of a curse element to him. I don't believe in curses and superstition in general, but I do believe players actually get that in their head, and that psychologically is something that fucks with them, and I think that was something that affected him and his teams. Whenever things started to go wrong, they'd be like, oh god, it's the Debears curse. And famously, I mean, Hare even said this in his reflections, you kind of knew the Debears curse was going to come, and you just almost hoped you could prepare for it and work around it. Now, as well as him being a funny guy and an ADD guy, he was a very ditzy guy in as much as he would do some crazy shit. He's one of those guys from the era where you didn't have to have sponsors to go to CPL because it was just in America. You just got in a van with a bunch of other people and drove 300 miles to the CPL. So he once went to a tournament, I remember, where he had to boot camp before and play the Lethal Gamers LAN. And I remember an NA pro telling me Debears turned up and he literally had like $12 in his pocket or something for like 2 weeks of 2 LANs and a bunch of staying in a hotel room on the floor and stuff. So only the grace and kindness of others even probably fed this guy during that LAN. But that's kind of how all out he was at the time, just living to play these LANs and try and be one of the best. Now, if you want to see the guy's skills, first of all, he's a player who released a lot of POV demos in his day. He was a classic player to release entertaining online games, and there's a lot of great demos out there from him. So people knew his skills and he was a popular player. But actually, a good frag movie was made of him by a guy called High Five, who, by the way, his next frag movie would be Nothing But Headshots, one of the best frag movies of all time. And the Debears movie's pretty good. It's not amazing, but it's good and it shows off his skills. You also see how many different clans he plays in. He was in many frag movies because, first of all, he released a lot of POV demos, and a lot of the frag movies guys would reach out to him and he'd be willing to oblige. So he was also, for example, in the Killing Spree series made by Gozy, the famous demo admin of So Gamed and SK Gaming, where he was in classically Killing Spree 4, which I'll put up there, where he's got a whole bunch of clips because, first of all, Gozy was a fan of his and Gozy asked him and he sent him the clips because he's a cool guy in that sense. Now, if you want to know more about Debears, aside from watching him put up or shut up with me when we're on that show, he's a really funny guy, you can also watch a Reflections. No, wait, it wasn't Reflections. It was actually a Grilled. It was the series before Reflections when I used to work for Acer, where I went to IPL 5, where he was working for like Turtle Beach or someone at the time, some tech company who did like headsets or some shit. And at this tournament, or was it MLG Dallas in 2013? Might have been MLG Dallas, was it? No, I think it was IPL 5. So at this tournament, I did a Grilled with him about a bunch of these things from his career, and you can see an interview with him there. And yeah, that's who Debears is. You probably didn't know all that info. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff you can go and watch now. But yeah, cool guy, certainly a skilled player, but just one of those guys where sometimes it's skill, isn't it? You've got to have a certain mentality for competing, and you've got to get some breaks go your way as well. He did have it go his way once in epic fashion at one of the best tournaments of all time. But other than that, a guy who was very hard done by and kind of was like the T-Mac of his generation.
Hi, this is Natu, a guy who's way too old and way too long involved in this game, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.